Circuit 42 would like to thank Pop Culture Paradise, Toy Anxiety, the Spawn Point Gamers Lounge, and Dragon's Lair San Antonio.
Hey everybody, this is Ian McIntosh of Geeks4Comics, and today in this studio that totally exists, we have a special guest with us. Who are you, special guest?
I am David Michelinie.
And for those who don't know, those 5 people on the internet who don't know who you are you and what do you do?
Well, I'm still David Michelinie. I'm a writer. I have written over 600 comic book stories, a couple of novels, half a dozen short stories, TV animation, and even had a couple of poems published.
So, now there is a particular company you've worked with, done a ton of comic book work, Archie Comics. Okay, Marvel. But those are kind of the same thing. They both publish comic books and they're both on paper. And one of the 2 big particular books, the 2 ones you're very well known for, are your work on Iron Man and your work on Amazing Spider-Man. And first thing I wanted to ask you, now the one thing that a lot of people don't know is that your work has been brought into the movies in many, many ways as of recently, especially with Iron Man, Demon in a Bottle, and Armory Wars. Now, as somebody who's had such a large amount of work being adapted into other mediums like this, especially in the last few years, what do you think of the work, and how do you think they've gotten across what you've created?
Well, you got to look at it from the point of view that it's 2 different media. It's printed word on paper and moving real people on a screen talking. I think Marvel has done a fairly good job with what they had. They used a character I created named Venom in the 3rd Sam Raimi Spider-Man movie. In the comics, there was a whole thing about the original Secret Wars. That was the origin of this symbiotic costume the Spider-Man wore. Well, they couldn't go into the whole Secret Wars, so they give it a different origin. They had to do that. They handle it fairly well, like I say, within the constraints of their medium. And the Iron Man, I think they've done a very good job, particularly with the first one. And in the 3rd one, they finally got character Jim Rhodes right. He was always supposed to be a friend and of Tony Stark's, and fight side by side with him. We never saw him. We, meaning my co-plotter Bob Layton and I, never saw him as a superhero, which they turned him into a war machine in the comics and in the movies. He was basically a guy to be Tony Stark's friend, and they got that right in the 3rd movie. So they had him fighting side by side with fists and guns. That's Tony and Rudy. So they've done some good things, some bad things. And I guess it was the 2nd movie where they used just the hammer. They used just the name in the Iron Man movie. We had based that character on Peter Cushing, the very sophisticated British actor, and they turned him into kind of a buffoon. The actor, Sam, was it Waterston?
Rockwell.
Rockwell, thank you. He's a terrific actor. He did what he could with the script, but it was basically nothing to do with what was done in the comics. So it's hit or miss. You can't control it. You just got to say, like a lot of authors whose books have been turned into movies, if you want to read the real story, read the book. So kind of got to read the comics if you want to read the real story. But, you take what you can get, and you hope you're spelling your name right.
So coming to that, like I really got into comics at the kind of late 80s, early 90s, and that was right around the time that you were writing Amazing Spider-Man. And one of the big things I wanted to ask, because you created Venom with Todd McFarlane, and then later on you created Carnage with Eric Larson. And one of the big things I want to ask, especially with Venom, is that there was that kind of overexposure. Like Marvel kind of wanted him everywhere, and they tried to turn him into like a vigilante character. Did you ever have any intention on that? Because when I read your Venom, he always came across as, while he had his motivations, he came across as this absolute sadist in my eyes. And it seems like, and I always wondered if you had in your vision of that whole like anti-hero vigilante thing that Marvel tried to turn him into.
No, well, first off, I believe believe the first artist on Carnage was Mark Bagley.
I'm dumb.
Okay. But anyway, now I always saw Venom as a psychopathic mass murderer. He was crazy, but he had his own twisted sense of morality. He thought he was the good guy because Spider-Man had wronged him. In his twisted mind, he was the good guy going after Spider-Man, who was the bad guy. I always use the analogy of, like, if he saw a kitten up a tree, he would go save that kitten because he's the good guy. Now, if he had to go literally through a bus full of nuns and orphans and kill them all to get to that kitten, he would do that because he's the good guy. But he was sick and twisted. As far as making him vigilante, I was offered twice that Marvel wanted to give Venom his own series and make him, a sort of a hero. I was offered the job twice and turned it down twice. The third time, they made it into a mini-series, which better fit my schedule. I finally accepted it, figuring, okay, if I set it up so that it's believable, maybe those who come after me will follow that rule, follow that lead. If I let it just go, I don't know what's going to happen to the character. I wanted to try to be true to the character. So I did that first miniseries. I set it in San Francisco, which was as far away from Manhattan as you can get, still be on the continental United States, because Venom's other motivation was to kill Spider-Man. I did a story once where he thought he killed Spider-Man, and Venom ceased to exist. It became Eddie Brock and the symbiote. That was his motivation. So if he was anyone on the East Coast, he'd still try to kill Spider-Man. So I set him over in San Francisco. And I went with this twisted morality that, he thinks he's the good guy. And I tried to make that work. Whether it did or not, I can't say. I did my best. And then I left it. And then a lot of other people came to editors, writers, they did what they wanted. But I tried to set it up so that it would make sense. And, but no, I never really wanted him to be any kind of good guy because he's the psychopathic killer.
Yeah, see, that was the thing. Like, I think very much. A lot of people talk about how the 90s was very editorially driven, and the funny thing is, like, it's as much today, but they're just different about it. But I think, like, if you look at what Ron Perelman and them did with the company, it seemed like they just wanted to keep pushing the characters because they were selling. So let's keep doing this. Now, were you working for Marvel at the time of the when Perelman and them had come into the company and kind of done what they'd done?
What time was that?
That would have been around 96, 97 when the company, when Perelman and them basically pushed the company into bankruptcy because they kept trying to just do the same thing over and over and over because they assumed, hey, we're making money now, so let's just keep doing it to make more money.
No, I left Marvel around 1993 and worked for DC Comics for about 3 years. So 96, I was working for DC.
So with that, one of the last things I wanted to ask you regarding Spider-Man is, well, actually, we'll probably go into more than that, but
that's okay.
This looking at Carnage, this is a character you created, who there was no way that, in my opinion at least, there's no way a company would want to turn this guy into a bad guy, to a good guy, because he was like Joker levels of psychotic. And for me, I've always thought that was interesting, and I wanted to ask you. It seemed like, in my opinion, this character was written to show that at least Venom has at least Eddie had some kind of control, and then it shows what happens when a complete monster, where even that slight bit of conscious gets the symbiote. And I wanted to ask you about that character in comparison to Venom.
This makes me feel very good because you nailed it right on the head. I mean, that's exactly why I created Carnage. I wanted to contrast him, and I wanted to point out Venom's twisted ethics, that he did have a sense of morality, even if it was psychotic. So that's exactly why Carnage exists, because I wanted to have someone that's like Venom without that little bit of morality.
Awesome. I'm glad I was able to pick that up, because that was me when I was a little kid. It's like, man, this guy is cool. Has blood, and then I read it years later, and it's like, I finally kind of get the psychology, because when you're 9, You're not thinking about the psychology. You're thinking of, wow, this guy is a Venom suit. They let him have blades.
Yeah.
Yeah. But looking at your run on that book, you worked with so many big artists. You worked with McFarlane, you worked with Larson, you worked with Bagley, and as far as just as far as like the creative chemistry, as far as the Spider-Man artist, who was your favorite to work with and why?
Well, it would have to be Todd McFarlane. He brought a new kind of imagery and energy to the book, and when he started, it was like it was just so much fun writing to those pictures, because at the time most of the work in Marvel was done what they call it Marvel style, which was a plot was done that was sent to a penciler drew the pictures. Those pictures were sent to the writer. The writer would have the dialogue, captions, sound effects, and it would go into an inker for the finished art. So I was writing my words through Todd's pictures, and he was such a good. Primarily, he was a good storyteller. He stuck to the plot. He made certain things clear. They were very entertaining and interesting to look at. So that made it a lot of fun to actually write those stories. So he'd have to be my pick.
All right, and one of the things I wanted to bring up with that, like you guys were right in the middle of the almost excessive amount of like multi-book crossovers in the 90s, which unfortunately it looks like it's happening again. And I wanted to ask about that because for me, like as a reader, it was confusing. Even like as a kid, especially, it was confusing because I always come into a book and it's like, hey, do you remember when Steve happened that thing happened? And I'm like, I'm 9. I read 3 comics, so I don't know. And I was wondering from a writer's perspective, especially during that time period, what it was like to have to deal with all that as you were putting out your book.
I didn't like it at all. It limited what you could do, what you wanted to do with the character. You had to follow other people's storylines. You had to leave your part of the picture, in the middle of something and let someone else handle it. It decreased the freedom. It added, had to do stuff you didn't want to do. I hated all the crossovers. If there's a crossover, I can cross over with one book and deal with that editor and writer and coordinate and so forth, fine. But when you got all these things going on and you're like 1/16th of a writer, I didn't find it fun.
I think, going back as an adult and rereading this, for me, I think one of the most successful books like that was probably, I know this wasn't by you, this was by DeMatteis and Zek, and that was the Kraven's Last Hunt, because they kept the same team, and it was only done through 2 books.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it's an editorial thing where they want to get as many books as possible just for the sale, just to increase the sales, or they just aren't able to get that kind of consistency.
Yeah, well, like you say, I was involved in that, so I don't know who was the instigator. I don't know. I just know. Initially, I worked for one editor, and he was very good gave me freedom. I would turn in a general storyline for the next several issues. He would go over that. He would ask for modification or changes. I would make modifications required, and he would approve those. And then I just went on and wrote about the first story, then the next, then the next, then the next. It's very efficient because I didn't have to wait issue after issue to get approved for the plot. I could do that and keep on schedule. So if you notice, while I was working with this one editor, I never had a fill-in because it was very efficient, and the artist was efficient, and we got the work done, and we were all happy. Then things changed. A new editor came on. That editor was very interested in sales and doing things for sales, events, crossovers. He threw the characters open to everyone in Marvel. Anyone who wanted to use Venom could use it. So until that point, I had been the only person who was writing Venom. But the previous editor was proprietary about it, and so every time there was a Venom story, it was a story that I had come up with that did something different with the character, that progressed the character. So I think the character remained interesting because he wasn't overdone, and every time he was there, he did something new. Now all of a sudden, it's all over the Marvel Universe. All of the Spider-Man characters are all in the Marvel Universe. Events happen, crossovers happen. commercially focused rather than creatively focused. And I think that was to the detriment of the book. But then again, I didn't have a lot of control at that time.
It is crazy because like it almost seems like it's cyclical in the industry because after the 90s, Joe Quesada came on, and initially one of the big things I appreciated was there weren't any big crossovers that you could follow. You could just read one book and get it. But then they started doing the crossover thing again, and it became a big event every single year. And it seems like we kind of came into that same area that we were before.
Yeah.
And it's so weird because people have this weird blanket that they throw over the 90s. Like you have these people say, oh, 90s comics were bad, 90s comics suck, blah, blah, blah. It's like, there were plenty of good books. There were a couple of bad books, but there's a couple bad books now. And I think a lot of these people who say that didn't really read those comic books. They're just saying what they've heard. And that's kind of why they're not noticing that what they're talking about and all the things that they have heard that were issues in the 90s are starting to happen again. But since they never really read those books, they don't know it's happening again. So moving from that, I wanted to talk about your work on Iron Man. And now I'm gonna try not to gush, but to me, your work is definitive. Like the work that you and Leighton did, that is Iron Man for me, and I bet for a lot of our listeners too.
Well, go ahead and gush about it.
So one of the two big stories I wanted to ask you about, of course, are Demon in a Bottle and Armory Wars. With Demon in a Bottle, it was just so interesting because it was a side of comic book characters we don't get to see very often. I mean, you had Speedy in Green Arrow dealing with heroin, but that was a sidekick supporting character. And with what you guys did, this was a main character, and it had a huge effect on him still to this day. And I just wanted to ask, what was that like, bringing a story out like that at that time, and how do you feel about the impact that it's had today?
Well, when I first came to work for Marvel, my first work was on Avengers, and then I was assigned Iron Man. Bob and I had worked on things in DC, so they put us both on Iron Man. And to be honest, I had never read an Iron Man comic in my life. So I read the previous, 3 or 4 or 5 issues leading up to my first issue. And Iron Man was like, his company was in trouble. The government was trying to regulate superheroes. He was having problems with S.H.I.E.L.D. And I thought, a real person would need an escape valve. And a real person would need something to lessen the pressure. And it had already been established that Tony was something of a playboy and went to parties and he drank. So I thought, well, it just seems realistic that he would start drinking a little more and a little more and a little more and then maybe lose control of that. So Bob liked the idea, so we went to Jim Shooter, the editor-in-chief at the time, and to his credit, it was a risk, and the only instructions that he gave us, the only caveats or whatever, is like, do it well. So we were given a lot of freedom. We came up with the stories, or we wrote them. It seemed like an organic progression of what the character was going through. It was a very interesting situation to explore creatively. So that's how it came about. Now, as far as the impact, I never intended to have an impact. All I wanted to do was write entertaining stories, and I hope I did that. The impact has surprised me and humbled me a bit. I have more than one time I've been at a convention and I've been sitting writing or signing stuff, and I've had someone say, I wanted to thank you for those alcoholism issues, because my father is an alcoholic and we were estranged. And when I read those, I got some insight on his feelings, and it opened the dialogue between us. Now we're close. So that's like, it's to realize it's something I did to make a living and to entertain myself and to entertain other people. It's actually affected in a positive way people who were totally strangers, people I'll never meet. It's just I sit back and think, oh my God, that's incredible. It's very, very pleasing and very humbling. So that's my answer.
And regarding Armory Wars, you created another storyline that would be that would have another large impact within, at least with comic book storytelling in the films. And that was bringing the idea of multiple armors. And the Armory Wars was just very cool because not only did it do that, but it also further to explore Stark as a character. And I just wanted to ask, what made you want to do that? What made you want to bring in more than just the standard armor that we'd seen before? And, how do you think that they've been able to accomplish and represent that in the films, like we were talking about earlier?
Well, first off, you're going to have to forgive me that I have to correct you again. It's actually the Armor Wars.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Armory Wars. So, okay. Now, to address your question, the two parts, as far as I think you asked about the Tony Iron Man having different armors. Was that part of the?
Yes.
Okay. Most of those were Bob was the science guy of the team, and when we were plotting, he handled most of the science stuff. I may have come up with an idea for an armor here or there, but it was his idea, I think, to have specialty armors. Now, as far as the Armor Wars, again, sadly, I have to give credit to someone else because I love taking credit myself. But I believe it was Jim Shooter who made the suggestion of what if, Tony Stark's technology had been actually put on the market and sold to bad guys, and bad guys were using Tony's inventions to create chaos and suffering. I think that happened over a dinner in New York, Jim. But it was a great idea, so I was happy to take it and use it, and we developed it and figured out what characters could work, and it showed him, going against bad guys and this terrible guilt, that what he had created had been creating all this chaos, but even more so putting him against Captain America, I think it was as the captain at that time, and other good guys, because he just had to get his technology back. He became obsessed with that. It was just an interesting exploration of the character of Tony Stark and what he was. Essentially, what we did with alcoholism, we explored Tony at his core, the nobility at his core, which came out at the time when it was needed. So that was the reason we did those stories.
Okay. Moving out of Marvel. Actually, before we do, I did want to ask about your work on Avengers and the creation of Taskmaster and how that character has kind of changed. So regarding Avengers, once again, you worked with you seem to have this tendency to work with giants in a way because you yourself are one. And with Avengers, you worked with John Byrne and George Perez.
Yeah, for the most part,
right. And I wanted to ask you regarding that comic book. Like it was very for me at least, it was very tonally different from from the work on Iron Man at least. It was very tonally different than the work that I read on Iron Man by you. And I just wanted to ask about your position as a writer and what your intentions were when you were writing that book.
Well, that was the first work I did for Marvel. The day that I decided I was leaving DC, I'd worked for DC for like 5 years, and I called Jim Shooter and asked if I could get some work for Marvel, and his response was, "Would today be too soon?" Which was very flattering. Unfortunately, I still had a little bit of time on I had a contract with DC, but when I came over to Marvel, Jim was writing Avengers, and he had become editor-in-chief, and it got to be too much. So I think it was 3 issues of the Avengers that I scripted over Jim's plots, to give him some time, to buy him some more time. And it was an education. I mean, I had not read a Marvel comic at all in 5 years. I worked for DC, and here were pretty much all the important heroes in the Marvel universe. And at the time, Jim was not writing out his plots. He would call the artist and talk the plot out with the artist, and the artist would take notes and draw them. So he did the same thing with me. He basically, when the pencil pages came in, he would go over the plot with me, and I would make notes. And it was like it was an education in Marvel's heroes, because Jim knew them so well, and the subtleties. And he would tell me how, when the Beast is in a meeting, he doesn't sit in a chair; he sits on the back of the chair. That's his nature. And this character would do this. This character acted that way. This character thought that. And it was a wonderful introduction to the Marvel universe. So that when Jim left the book, I also had a good background with what Jim had set up with the characters. So I approached it just as trying to follow Jim's lead. And that's maybe why that book was written different from Iron Man. On the other hand, each book I do, each series I have done, I have looked at the characters, tried to see what was unique about them. I tried to make an Iron Man story, not a superhero story with Iron Man. Same with Spider-Man, same with the Avengers, same with other characters I've done. So I think it was a combination of my viewpoint and Jim Shooter's background that made the Avengers stories what they were.
And in many ways, in my opinion, at least as a fan, that is the best. That's the best way to approach these characters, because I think one of the writers, particularly Mark Miller, the one thing when I read his early work on X-Men was that he tended to give all the characters the same voice, and that voice kind of perpetrated a lot of the early work that he did. And as a fan, the best thing you could do as a writer is to make sure the characters have those individual voices, because otherwise, they'll all start to sound like the writer.
I agree. I've actually known some other writers who do that to an extent, but I've actually advised. There's one particular writer I will not name who did a story with 4 different characters. They all sounded like they came from the same apartment building in the Bronx, and it was just like, no, one is a scientist from India, another was from England, another is a doctor. I tried to point that out. Whether it did any good, I don't know. But no, I agree. That's the thing that makes characters interesting is their differences, both in their viewpoints and in their speech patterns and in their actions.
So with that, I wanted to move now. Like you said earlier, you left Marvel in 1993, correct?
That sounds right. Yeah.
All right. So one of your more substantial, one of your bigger runs, at least in my opinion as a reader growing up, was your work on Superman. And I wanted to go into that, and I wanted to ask not only about your work on Superman and how you felt about what you did, but at the same time, when we had a previous show on here where it was kind of like a 90s roundtable, and we brought on Scott Lobdell and Devin Grayson, and they talked about how the editorial offices were just so vastly different between the two. And so I was curious not only about your work that you did and what came to your mind as you were writing Superman, but I was also wondering about the big differences between editorial at Marvel and DC at that time.
Well, it's kind of funny because when I first started working back in 1973 at DC was very, very much an art-oriented company. Writers didn't get a lot of respect. I could give a couple of examples, but I won't. I would be saying bad things about artists. There are experiences I had where artists screwed up the story, and I had to correct it by rewriting my script, even though I hadn't been the one who screwed up, and of course I didn't get paid for that. And like I say, when I left 5 years later in 1978, went to Marvel, the attitude was, can I get some work for today's be due soon? And I remember walking several times around Marvel's offices and having Jim Shooter see me and say, "Are you happy? Is everything going okay? Is there anything we can do?" They had so much more respect for writers. And I think it's maybe because so many of the editors at DC were artists, whereas so many of the writers were editors, Alan Shooter and Roy Thomas and Jerry Conway and Lynn Lee were writers. There's more respect given to the writing. And I think that kind of, I don't know if it twisted, but by the time I left Marvel, writers were, certainly I was getting less respect. And I went to DC, but I can't say for DC if it was all that much different, because I think they did respect writers more. But the only thing I did on a regular basis was Action Comics. I did that for 3 years. And in 3 years, I had 3 different editors. I had 3 different pencils. And it was at a time when they were doing Superman as a weekly. They were doing 4 monthly books and a quarterly. So I was basically 1/5 of the writers on ongoing series. Like you say about a crossover, it wasn't really a crossover, but the storylines went through all 5 books. So basically, it was difficult to judge the impact of the editor. I know the editor at the end very, very concerned about, in this case, about sales, and was doing things that he thought that would boost the sales, not necessarily to the detriment of the stories, but regardless of the stories. So it was difficult to tell because it was an atypical situation. I worked very, very few times with editors on specific, just solo series. I don't recall having a lot of trouble with those, but I'm not the one to judge because the situation I was in was an unusual one.
Now, the funny thing is, like, regarding Superman, you were talking about how it's editorially driven, but it really not to the point where it really had a negative impact on the writers. One of the things I've always thought was interesting, and one thing I've talked to people about before, like, everybody always says, like I said, a lot of people didn't read these books will go back and say, oh, look at the blue and red lightning Superman costume. Oh, it was so silly. And I always tend to tell them the big difference between, in my opinion at least, I don't know, and I wanted to see if you agreed that with DC, they would make changes like that, but the writing would still be consistently strong. It would not affect the story. They would not try to drive the stories as much. It would just they'd make tweaks to the character, but it didn't change it nearly as much as some of what was going on at other companies at the time. And I wanted to get your opinion on that.
I don't know. Again, my experience at DC, my second tenure there, whatever, was in a unique situation as far as tweaking the characters, not making changes. I guess they did make they changed the characters and they changed them back. The other series I did a Lex Luthor miniseries, the first 3 issues of Justice Task Force, the Legion miniseries called Science Police. But those again were limited, like 3 or 4 issue things. Hard to change something forever in a miniseries. So I'm really not the person probably to talk about that.
Not a problem. One of the things I want to ask you, and as we always ask on the show, what is the work that, as a writer, you're most proud of today? And what is the one work that you would like to go back and give a second look?
Well, it would be hard to pick one thing. I'll give you maybe 3
okay.
or 4. My favorite thing I've ever written in comics was a series I did for Epic called Proudest Chronicles, which, wait for the plug, it's actually being gathered by Dover Publications into a trade paperback scheduled to come out in September. It was drawn by Brett Blevins. It was my baby. I own it. I created it, and I got the perfect artist to draw it. It was just an absolute joy. I love that series. On the other hand, I have to be the next would be a tie between three characters. Very first series I did was The Unknown Soldier at Geeks4Comics originally, and Star Spangled War Stories, and it was like my goals when I started writing comics was sell a story, write a series, create a series. So that was the B on my schedule. The first series I did, I was given a lot of freedom. I changed the characters somewhat. I did what I think was a strong story. I liked it very much. That was early on, and then but both Amazing Spider-Man and Iron Man, the 2 you talked about, I had such fun doing both. It's a satisfaction with the end product for the most part, particularly Iron Man first run I did on that. Then it have to be Boss Chronicles, Iron Man, Spider-Man, and Soldier.
Awesome. And one of the things I wanted to bring up, you mentioned working with Jim Shooter and how much of a good experience that was. And you would actually go on to work with him at Valiant with Ray. And I wanted to ask what that was like, considering that, at the time, it was very Marvel and DC, but then at that time, other companies started to make a bigger and bigger impact. And I wanted to know what it was like working with Jim again and working on a book like Ray.
Okay. Here we go. My apologies for correcting you. It's actually pronounced Rye.
This is like how my brain read him as a kid.
That's okay. It's Japanese, and I don't think you or I either of us are Japanese. I don't speak it. You don't speak it. Jim named it. He pronounce it for me, so that's why I know it's right. But it was kind of nice because I was when I left Marvel, I was not a real happy man. I had not been happy with the last year or so of what I've been writing, and I was not being treated well by them. I was getting no work for them, so Jim offered me work in Marvel, Valiant rather, and it was exciting because it was brand new. They were building a universe, which is something that hadn't been done a whole lot in smaller companies. And of course, Jim, with his experience, knew what to do. And some of the things, the rules, they didn't want thought balloons. They didn't want to, I think, for a while at least, sound effects. They wanted to make them more, I guess, cinematic. It was a little difficult to follow some of the rules, but it was exciting. There was energy. The offices were basically one wide open loft in New York. It was kind of like, hey kids, let's put on a show. Everybody was enthusiastic. It kind of deteriorated towards the end. Good things always do, but it was a lot of fun. It was exciting work there for the time that I spent there.
And with that, I also wanted to ask you about about Valiant recently coming back, and the fact that last year not last year, but in 2013, they actually collected they've started collecting Rye in hardcover format.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask your opinion regarding the company coming back and this work being able to come back and people will be able to read it and see it again, or possibly for the first time.
Yeah. Well, I'm always very pleased when any of my old work is reprinted. Like you say, maybe some new readers will get a chance to read it. I wrote introductions for both the Rye and the hardcore collected books. I'm a little disappointed they never asked me to write any more stories for them, but because I know Jim Shooter wrote a new Harbinger story for the Harbinger collection, and Bob Layton wrote an Exo story for the Exo collection. But they got their reasons, and I wish them well. And I enjoyed writing the introductions, and I'm glad they reprinted my work. Hopefully, they'll reprint some more.
Awesome. And with that, is there any other work coming up that you want to talk about before we brought the show to a close?
Well, now other than the Bonds Chronicles trade coming out in September, I've got a couple of prose stories coming out in anthologies, paperback anthologies, ostensibly this fall. One of them is called, if anyone wants to look for them, Singularity, Rise of the Posthumans, which is supposed to come out from, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, Prose, 2 words, P-R-O, second word is E, Press. And the other one is, it's a steampunk superhero anthology, Shared World, which by itself is reason enough to buy the thing and see what the hell they did. The other one's called Giant 1968 Superhero Special, which is a prose homage to 1960s superhero characters, which I did a story for. Then I did 3 short stories for Charlton Neo, but I have no idea what's going on with that company at this point, so hopefully those will see print. Who knows? Meanwhile, I watch a lot of TV and read some.
Well, it was fantastic to have you on the show, and with this, we're coming to the close of our newest episode of Geeks4Comics. David, thank you for joining us. And with that, everybody, go read David's comics, or he's going to send Iron Man after you.
You betcha.